Hey, it's Bryce. Just 2 quick things before we get started. First, if you found something meaningful in these stories, if they've opened your eyes or stayed with you, I want to invite you to help amplify them. A simple way to do this is by rating, reviewing, and subscribing to Fracture to Flourish. It's not just about numbers. It helps more people discover these voices and brings more attention to the young people at the heart of this series. Second, a quick heads up. This episode contains sensitive material, including stories of trauma, loss, and the real-life challenges faced by youth in the foster care system. These are personal stories. They're raw, they're honest, and they come from people who've chosen to share deeply vulnerable parts of their lives. Not because it's easy, but because it matters. So please listen with care and listen with respect. These are real people, not case studies. Their stories deserve to be held gently. If any part of this episode feels heavy for you, know that it's okay to pause, to take a break. And if you need support, please reach out to mental health resources in your area. All right, here's the episode. Welcome back to Fracture to Flourish. Last time we heard from 3 young people on the edge of something huge, the moment childhood ends. And not in the way most of us think. No cake, no toast, no milestone celebration, just a system closing its doors behind them. A birthday that feels more like an eviction notice. And here's the thing most people don't quite get about foster care. It's not just a system, it's a maze. Twisting, overwhelming, full of stops and starts and paper trails that lead nowhere. So today, we're stepping inside that maze. Because if we want to understand what it means to age out, we have to understand what these young people are aging out of. Think back to your own childhood. You probably had some constants, a bedroom that was yours, a school where teachers remembered your name. That's not the story we're telling today. Instead, imagine childhood as something written in pencil, always being erased and redrawn. A new house, a new school, a new adult telling you, this time it's different. And even before you learn to tie your shoes, you start to understand that nothing lasts. Not the bed you sleep in, not the people who tuck you in at night. So that's where we're starting. Not with policy briefings or press releases, but with what it actually means to grow up in a system meant to protect you, but that sometimes just doesn't. When Lance Vileo stepped into his role leading Tennessee Governor's Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, he already knew that kids were sleeping in DCS offices because there weren't enough foster homes. The numbers said it all. But the thing about statistics is they don't prepare you for what it feels like to see it. So one night, Lance walks into a DCS office in downtown Memphis where 15 kids are spending the night, sleeping under fluorescent lights on makeshift beds. He knew what to expect, but knowing and seeing, those are 2 different things. And what happened next? Well, it's the kind of moment that makes every policy memo feel irrelevant. Because sometimes it takes standing in an office that should be a home with a 4-year-old wrapped in a blanket to understand what the system really looks like.
This is probably the first month that I was on the job, and at the time it was just me. There's all these acronyms. Government has so many acronyms. Like what is DCS and DHS and all the, it just was impossible to figure out. But we knew that there were kids sleeping in offices, and I was going around trying to tour these different offices to just see it and get connected to the work, hear from caseworkers. I knew that there was a group of about 15 kids that were sleeping in the Shelby County office. I walk in, I've got my arms full of dinner, and it's in this big old corporate building in downtown Memphis. And it's a little shocking to see kids in a government building at 8:30 at night. Go set the food down, and I feel like this thing wrapped around my leg. I look down, this is this little 4-year-old girl. This beautiful little black girl, biggest smile on her face. I kneel down and I'm like, hey, what's your name? And she said, oh, my name is Harmony. And she said, and guess what? I am so brave. It's like, yeah, you are brave. And she said, and I'm going to be okay because my sister, and she pointed to this girl across the room, is with me. And she pointed to this little 14-year-old girl. She kind of gave me a wave, and, it's like everything I had not to burst into tears, and just this very emotional moment of like, this is it. This is on the ground as close as you can get. These are two kids that have just been removed from their home for whatever reason, no fault of their own, and they're sitting in a DCS building in downtown Memphis. We have dinner and it's awesome, and I pull one of the caseworkers, supervisors aside, and I said, what's the story on Harmony? And please tell me you guys have a home, And she said, there's not a home in Shelby County that can take these two girls. And so we're going to have to separate them, and they're going to have to go so that they can sleep in a bed tonight. It's just kind of the world stood still. How are we here? How are we here? Like, I know that if people knew this in Memphis, they would not be okay with it. They just don't know. They do not know.
Imagine that moment. Two sisters holding onto each other in a government office, about to be split apart. Not because of abuse or neglect, but simply because there's not a place able to take them together. It's a quiet kind of heartbreak, but it reveals so much. Because when a child is removed from their home, it's not just their parents they lose, it's their entire world, their school, their friends, their siblings, everything that gave them a sense of belonging. In this episode, we meet three remarkable individuals, Gabe, Heather, and Crystabella, who've endured the impossible transition from foster care to adulthood. Their stories reveal a system stretched thin, where support too often comes too late, if at all. But they also reveal something powerful, the resilience to survive, the courage to heal, and the quiet hope that transformation is still possible. We'll hear about instability, betrayal, and loss, but also about growth, recovery, and the people who choose to stay. This is Fracture to Flourish. First up is Gabe, and he's actually one of those stories that we celebrate. A college graduate, a successful career, a steady family man. But even Gabe will tell you the disconnection starts early, long before any case file, long before foster care.
I entered the foster care system when I was in the 7th grade. My dad ended up losing his parental rights a year after that, so we moved in with him. But really, before that, we grew up in chaos. I mean, I moved around a ton. My parents were never married, and I spent most of my childhood, bouncing back and forth between my parents. My mom struggled with alcoholism and was super abusive, both, emotionally and physically. Now, she was a hard worker, and so, we thankfully were never homeless, and for the most part had, food on the shelves. But just the alcoholism was really a big problem. So even before foster care, right, I had pretty significant trauma. One of my most poignant memories is riding the bus home every day after school, and you would just have this sinking feeling in your stomach. Okay, what am I going to be walking into tonight? And the bus would pull up, and I can just vividly remember getting up, walking to the front of the bus, and waiting to see if I could hear music playing from the house. Because if mom was on a bender, she would normally crank the music up and would be cleaning or working or doing something. And so if you heard music playing, you did your best to sneak in through the side door, kind of slink up the stairs to your room, and just try to avoid the abuse for the night, which was usually unsuccessful. But that's kind of how we grew up.
You know what stands out in Gabe's story? Not just where it ends up, but where it begins. Because long before anyone labeled him foster youth, he was already living in uncertainty. His life was shaped by chaos, bouncing between homes, reading the moods of adults like weather patterns. And then there's this moment, this precise point in time when everything shifts, One day you're just a kid with a complicated family situation, and the next, well, you become what they call a ward of the state. And it happens just like that.
I worked up the courage to go to school and tell them that my mom was abusing us. I don't know what finally clicked, right? But that took a lot because I remember just wrestling with am I betraying my brothers and my sister by doing this? Am I I think it just, there's this break there. It's embarrassing to go and do that. You're walking in, and I can imagine the receptionist, any kid that came in, because I had to call my mom because I forgot lunch money, or I had this or I had that, right? And it's hey, I need to speak with a counselor, and to just to talk about what happened. That really for me was stepping out into the unknown, because I had no idea what was going to happen after that. From there, it was basically in foster care or residential care until I graduated high school. The other thing I will say is sometimes the timeline is blurry, not because I'm trying to be evasive, but just because whether it's suppressed memories or what, I don't know. But the timeline isn't always super, super clear for me.
Memory is a tricky thing, but especially when you're in foster care. I've heard it again and again, the way that time blurs, details go missing. It's like flipping through a photo album where the pictures are out of order and some are just gone. Imagine trying to remember where you lived when you're 10 and not having an answer. Because you move so many times, your past feels more like a fog than a timeline. And that's what life in the system does. It turns childhood into a series of transitions. And this brings us to Crystabella. Her story? It certainly will grab your attention because what she's lived through forces us to rethink what home even means, especially when it keeps changing its address.
I was taken away and placed to my grandmother's a bunch before I was a teenager and actually put in foster care. There was an incident where I was placed back at my mom's mother's. It was picture day and I wanted to have a certain pair of shoes. I was 7 years old and I took a tantrum and I just ran out of the house, but I went to school. But my mom, when she left my baby brother unattended in the house with the door open. And my mom came into the guidance office or whatever you call it, and she openly admitted that, oh my God, I left my son. And that made them want to call social services. And then social services came and knocked on the door, and again, she saw how nasty the house was, and she saw that there was just stuff that was unsafe for the child. He was sleeping on the couch, and they just didn't think that was safe. They saw that I didn't have a bed, and I was sleeping out of a dresser drawer, and there was a lot of bugs, and the place was had dog feces, and it really reeked of cat urine, and they was concerned. So they ended up giving me to my grandparents.
7 years old. That's when Crystabella's life began to change in ways that she couldn't understand. One moment, she's living with her mom. The next, she's being sent to her grandparents. But it wasn't a one-time thing. It was the beginning of a long chain of moves. So 7, you go to live with your grandparents. So but between the time you're 7 and you're 18, how many different placements or places did you end up living in?
30.
30?
Yeah.
Wow. Can you imagine that? Not 3, not 13, 30. Now just let that number wash over you for a second. That's 30 times that a young girl had to walk into a strange house, smile at unfamiliar faces, and try to figure out where she fits into this new puzzle. 30 times learning which floorboards creak on the way to the bathroom. 30 different breakfast routines. 30 first nights in a new bed, staring up at an unfamiliar ceiling, wondering if this time might be different. That's not just instability, it's erosion. It wears down at your sense of identity, your trust, your hope that anything or anyone is gonna last. And through it all, there's this dance with her mom, reunification, separation, repeat, a rhythm that starts to feel inevitable, even when it hurts. The system holds on to this hope that families can heal, that things can be repaired, and sometimes they can. But for Crystabella, the cycle always brought her back to the same place: disappointment.
My mom would always do what they would, as her case plan. She would always, she would have to do anger management classes and stuff like that, and, have to have an apartment. And they would just always put me back with her. 1 or 2 months would go by, or sometimes even 5 months, and it would be good. And then just an incident would happen. And so the incident when I first officially went into foster care, I'm going to try not to get emotional about it. I was 14, and my brother got raped. Yeah. By my mom's boyfriend. And I'm okay. I was living with my granny at the time, of course. I decided to officially just not go back with my mom. I was tired of the back and forth.
There's this point in Crystabella's story where hope turns into something heavier. Not just disappointment, but disillusionment. And it's heartbreaking. Because she doesn't make that choice lightly. She just gets tired of the cycle, the back and forth, the promises that fall apart. And that's the thing the system doesn't always see, how exhausting it is to keep hoping. Because you start to believe that maybe there isn't a version where it works out.
My mom dealt with mental illness, okay? And my mom's mom also dealt with mental illnesses. And I didn't know until I obviously got older and questioned her about how she grew up. But my mom dealt with a lot of abuse growing up.
Here's the thing about trauma. It never starts with the child. Most of the time, it goes back generations. Unhealed pain that's passed down like an unwanted heirloom. Crystabella's story is full of those echoes. Mental illness and instability, confusion, all wrapped up in the adults that are meant to care for her. And the system? Well, it steps in, but often it just treats the symptoms. It's like pulling a kid out of the fire and then expecting them to walk it off. Those deeper wounds, the ones beneath the surface, those are left for them to figure out on their own. So what happens instead? Kids like Crystabella get caught in this strange kind of dance, moving from home to home, never quite unpacking their bags, never quite letting their roots grow deep. And they develop this uncanny ability, almost like a sixth sense, to read the signs of the change coming. It's the kind of instinct that you never wish a child has to develop, and is the kind of thing that they remember long into adulthood. This constant disappointment.
I knew, I could always tell when it was about to happen, because the foster parents I had would become distant. Yeah, they would become distant. I would get this sick feeling in my stomach, and I just knew.
You can hear it in her voice, that hyper-awareness, always scanning, always bracing. She remembers the way foster parents would go quiet, and that gut feeling, like, this is it, another goodbye is coming. It's emotional muscle memory, and it doesn't just fade. When you grow up bouncing from home to home, you learn to pack light. Not just your clothes, but your heart also. You learn not to settle in, not to expect too much, not to believe that anyone really is going to stay. So when somebody does leave, when the adults walk out, it doesn't just hurt. It confirms what you've been bracing for all along.
The lies that the social services tell you, they promised me that me and my brothers were going to be adopted, and then before it happened, they literally told me, we're sorry for lying to you, but we knew that if we told you the truth, you'd run away. So, and then there was a time that I had a foster family, and I thought they just didn't want me no more, and they told them to tell me they didn't want me no more. And then it come down to it that they was just feeding me too much. I gained a lot of weight with them, and they thought it was unhealthy of how much they was feeding me, going out to eat and stuff. And they asked them to stop and made me walk. They wanted them to make me walk to school, and it was during winter, but my foster dad refused to do that. So they took me from them, but they made them look like the bad guys. And I didn't realize how much that hurted me, because I expected them to adopt me. There's just better ways that social services could handle things.
This constant anxiety about the next move has real consequences. Tom Baldwin, Director of Strategy and Development for Belmont Innovation Labs, has studied these effects extensively.
every time a child gets moved in the foster care system, the educational level falls backwards. So if you have 15 moves, or we've had kids with as many as 50 plus moves, you're typically moving school. And so when you start to move school that often, you're less concerned about keeping up with the curriculum, and you're more concerned about where am I going to be next. So your focus on completing the different aspects of school start to take more of a back seat as survival and other aspects of your life start to take a front seat.
Life in foster care rewires your whole operating system. It's like these kids develop this survival instinct that takes precedence over everything else. Think about it. When you're constantly wondering about your next move, math homework starts to feel pretty irrelevant. Sure, your grades slip, and that's what the statistics will tell us. But what's really happening is something deeper, something much more fundamental. These kids aren't just falling behind in school, they're learning a completely different curriculum. While their peers are studying algebra, they're becoming experts in reading the subtle signs of impending change and becoming masters in the art of keeping their emotional guard up. For Gabe, this played out in ways that would both break your heart and impress you at the same time. He developed this sort of, well, let's just call it what it is, a survival manual for life in the system.
Where I do think I've developed some of my resiliency and some of my ability to just say like, hey, we're going to figure this thing out. I remember having to go to middle school. I think I had been going to Portage Middle School already. So I don't think it was like my first time at the school. But my foster mom is like, I'm not going to take you. You're going to ride the bus. Like, I bought you bus passes. And so I've never ridden the city bus before. I have no idea like how these interchanges work. And I just like get up, get dressed, go wait at the bus stop, and then like figure it out. It's good. It's fine now. Like, I look back and it's not that big of a deal. But when you're 12 or 13, like, it's kind of a scary situation. Like, you get dropped off in downtown Fort Wayne at this busy bus exchange, and you got to get through that and then make sure you get off at the right stop and that the timing all works out. And so there are just a lot of things like that you had to just like figure out.
Foster care forces kids to become these strange hybrids, part child, part adult. And here's what I mean. While most kids are learning multiplication tables and worrying about recess, these kids are learning how to read city bus schedules. They're navigating social services. They're managing caseworkers, appointments, court dates. They're basically running their own personal life command centers. And yeah, Gabe will tell you it made him resilient, and he's probably right. But here's the part I can't stop thinking about. What happens when you're forced to run before you've even learned to walk? And then there's this one detail, something so small, and yet every foster youth I've spoken with has brought it up, completely unprompted. It's the trash bag. I mentioned it briefly in the last episode, but here it is again, etched into another person's memory.
Because I remember walking through the threshold of my first foster home, and you've got everything you own in a bag, especially like with a trash bag. What does that communicate? I mean, one, I think it's like, hey, your valuables, like the things that you have, the things you're toting around with you, like are not really valuable. And I think it is a sign of like scarcity as well. Like everything you have literally can fit in this little, what are they now, like 14-gallon bag.
Can you imagine a child standing on yet another unfamiliar doorstep, clutching a black plastic trash bag that holds everything they own in the world? You know the kind, those generic kitchen bags you get at the grocery store. We explored this some in episode 1, but for yet another child, it's become this haunting symbol of life in foster care, this detail that stays with you. But here's the thing. It's not just about the bag itself. It's about what the bag says to a child, without even saying a word. It's like the system is whispering, your stuff, your life, your story, it all fits into something that we usually use for garbage. And that message, it sinks in deeper than any well-meaning pep talk ever could.
And really just a sense of like instability. So it's like insignificance and instability. And some of this I think is my specific story of like moving around a ton. But like I seem to like always have memories in my childhood of like never really unpacking. Because whether I was like moving in with my dad or I was like moving in with my mom, and even growing up with my mom, like we had a house fire and we rented for a period. And so we like bounced around a lot. I just like, there was never a sense where it was like, okay, I'm going to take the things the abundance that I've been given, like through a family that's stable and that loves me, like I'm going to put these things in their place and they're going to stay here. It was always like, no, you got to keep them ready to move. And there's no point in taking the time to create any sort of organization, because in any moment, right, you might be somewhere else, having to make new friends, having to like learn a new like school system, dealing with new adults that are strangers and their new rules. Like they've got a whole new set of like expectations of how they think the world should operate inside their home. And so I don't know if I get all of that like from the trash bag like as a kid, or if some of that's like looking back, right? But there's just this like level of like, man, is there a level of intentionality that's like being missed, and just like in subtle communications of how we tell these kids that they are loved and they are looked after, and like the things that they have, like even if they aren't plentiful and abundant, like they are important.
These children are constantly living with one foot out the door, not just physically with their belongings, but emotionally as well. It's fascinating, really, how this perpetual state of readiness seeps into every corner of their lives. And think about what this does to a child, when every relationship comes with an invisible expiration date, when every goodbye feels less like see you later and more like a rehearsal for the next farewell. It rewires how you connect with people. It's like learning to dance while expecting the music to stop at any moment.
If you think about traditional childhood, you have friends. You may move a couple of times, but you have friends throughout your childhood that remain friends into adulthood. And then there's the emotional aspect, right? It's getting settled with a family, hoping that it'll be the last, and finding out that they didn't want you anymore or they couldn't hack it anymore. It was really devastating. There was one time where I settled into a home with my brother and we thought they were going to adopt us. I think I was in 7th grade. And they said, hey, we have to go pack up and go down to the Division of Family Services office, the foster care office, for a meeting. And they took us into a room and they had left us. They were already gone. So without our things, without any notice, like imagine what that does to a 7th grader. Most of the time, we just moved around with a trash bag of our belongings.
That was Heather, and we met her briefly in the last episode. Now she's a cybersecurity and anti-fraud leader at Microsoft. But her memories of school, of being a teenager in care, they sound a lot like survival. Heather didn't just carry the label of foster kid, she carried the weight of being different and the isolation that came with it. No new clothes, no sports teams, no summer vacations, nothing that made her feel like she belonged. And here's the thing, those feelings don't just magically disappear when you turn 18. They follow you like a shadow that you can't shake off.
That moment where we were just dropped off, we were lied to and we were tricked, and the next place we landed in was actually a group home. And to me, even though we were in a lot of foster homes, being in that group home situation, I think was the bottom of, like, to me, it was like the pit of my childhood. Hopeless, homeless, and helpless with no real end, right? I remember laying in a bed in the group home wondering what was going to happen to me.
That moment Heather describes, being dropped off at the DCS office, left behind without warning, and then sent to a group home. She calls it the bottom. Hopeless, homeless, helpless. It's a triple punch that too many kids in the system experience. And it's not just because no one cares. It's because the system is overwhelmed, under-resourced, and often operating in crisis mode. But that doesn't soften the impact, because when you're a teenager already hanging on by a thread, what that move really says is, you're not wanted. Again. Take Crystabella's story. When she hit that so-called magic number 18, the system did what it's designed to do, something that many don't even get. It handed her an apartment key, some paperwork for financial aid, and basically said, good luck. On paper, it looked like support. But without someone to walk alongside her, without those deep roots of stability that most of us take for granted, she was on her own. And the truth is, when you step out into the world without a safety net, people can tell. And that kind of vulnerability isn't invisible. It's easy to overlook and even easier to exploit.
Started out with a boy, I was fresh out. I've never done, like, you know how teenagers are when they get to be with their friends, party, and like have little, you know what I'm saying? I never done none of that. Now looking back at it, back then I was very insecure. I had low self-esteem. First guy that called me pretty, my pants was down. And the first guy that noticed me, I was 18 years old, and I ended up getting with a 32-year-old.
I mean, if you look at just the statistics, right, and especially for men, it shows that 70% of the men that exit the foster care system without supportive adult relationships will end up incarcerated. 70%. And that number can hover. You'll see it hover between, call it 60 and 80, right? Depending on where you're at. I think it changes based on where you come from in terms of what part of a city or what type of environment you come from. So it definitely ranges, but let's just say that's significant, right? And it's due to what we talked about in terms of trying to make a living, trying to put a roof over your head. And it's unfortunate that some of the systems that operate in our world, right, criminal system and the human trafficking system actually benefit from this population not being cared for. It becomes a feeder for them to be able to find youth that through their desperation are willing to do things that a lot of people wouldn't be willing to do. For human trafficking, for the girls in pregnancy, that's a real reality for them in terms of what that could look like. Because they're trying to find stability, maybe sometimes through relationship. And unfortunately, they're being, victimized and being in relationships that aren't healthy for them in an effort of trying to find some level of stability.
70%. That's the number Tom points to. 70% of young men who age out of foster care without stable adult relationships will end up incarcerated. And that statistic, it doesn't exist in isolation. It's connected to everything that we've been talking about. Unstable housing, untreated trauma, the absence of belonging. But there's another layer as well. The people waiting to take advantage of that vulnerability. Because when no one shows up to guide you, someone else always does. And not all of them have your best interests at heart. For many former foster youth, incarceration doesn't come from violence or rebellion. It comes from survival, from manipulation, from being seen as easy to control and easier to blame. That's what happened to Crystabella. Her descent into addiction, it didn't start in a jail cell. It started with a man twice her age, offering attention at a moment when she needed to feel seen. What follows was a spiral, one that led to not just drugs and homelessness, but eventually to prison. And not because she's the one committing the crimes, but because someone else was willing to let her take the fall. Her story isn't rare. It's what happens when systems fail, when trauma goes untreated, and when the line between victim and offender gets blurred by survival.
By this time, I'm a full-blown heroin, fentanyl, methamphetamine junkie. I'm shooting it up. When I tell you that guy was like an angel with devil disguise, yeah. He basically convinced me to take a charge. We was in a hotel room. I was a prostitute. I ended up prostituting. I was homeless. We was both homeless. Like I said, I was a full-blown junkie. I was shooting dope. And when you're homeless, like, you pretty much have to do whatever you have to just survive. And that's kind of what it becomes in the madness. It's just like an animal instant survival world, Basically, we was going to go to rehab, and we try to go through a meth dealer to help us go to rehab. Like I said, when you're in the madness, you don't really think straight. Like, we was flopping like a fish on her floor. I looked at him and I just said, let's rob her. So we robbed her. And so here we go. We took all her shit and took her car, went to Lexington. I had her car for like a couple of days. We was in a hotel room. I ended up getting in trouble in Georgetown for prostitution. So I ran from, obviously I was on the run. And then a narcotics officer set me up. I had to go, obviously, to jail. I had a warrant on me. I had to sit 4 days. That was the first time I probably actually detoxed. It was hell. They OR'd me that night. I literally was high that night. And I just thought to myself, like, if they were smart, they would have kept me.
You know how people talk about the school to prison pipeline? Well, there's another pipeline that most people never hear about, the foster care to prison express. And it's not some tragic coincidence. It's what happens when you take young people, kids who've already endured more instability, loss, and trauma than most of us could ever survive, and then push them off the cliff at 18, slap a label on it and call it independence, and walk away. And let's be honest, that's not independence. That's abandonment. And what strikes me again and again, sitting across from these young people, hearing them speak their truth, it's not just the practical stuff they're missing. Yes, housing matters, ID cards, food, jobs, bus fare, medical care, all of that matters. But underneath it, there's something deeper, something that lodges in the body, in the nervous system, in the quiet moments that no one sees. It's the belief that you don't belong, that people leave, that help won't come, that love, if it ever shows up, has an expiration date. This is what trauma does. Even when everything looks stable on the outside, there's still that whisper in the background. Don't get too comfortable. Don't trust this. Don't count on anyone. And yet we keep telling them to be independent, to pull themselves up by bootstraps that they never had. But the truth is, independence is a myth. We all lean on someone. We all have a number we dial when life crashes in. We're not built for isolation. We're wired for interdependence. That's the difference between falling and being caught, between barely surviving and finally starting to thrive. But here's the part we rarely talk about. When you age out without support, without protection, without a community, you don't just fall through the cracks. You fall into the hands of people who know exactly what to look for. The ones who see vulnerability as opportunity, who exploit, manipulate, and traffic young people, often hiding in plain sight. It's not rare, it's not random, and it's not something you can ignore. We'll go deeper into this in Season 2, into the system that fails and the predators that wait, into the stories that no one wants to tell, but need to be heard. Because it doesn't have to be this way. We can build something better, not just for show, but for real, with connection, with relationship, with the kind of support that doesn't disappear the moment a kid turns 18. That's how we stop the cycle. That's how we start to heal.
I think sometime in middle school, I just was pissed that this is what I'd been dealt, and I'm stubborn. I feel like somewhere like I had a fire in me that wanted a different life. I don't know exactly when that kind of came, maybe sometime through middle school. Just wanted a different life. I wanted a different something for myself. And then 15, 16 years old, I went through a little bit of therapy. And I reflect on that a lot because that's when I learned that I wasn't broken. I had a chance. And this created some mental health challenges for me, but I could overcome them. The one thing that a lot of foster children are challenged with is they don't understand that their brain has actually been wired differently and that everyone is not against them and that the world can be wonderful. And when you learn, hey, your brain is telling you lies and it's because of this trauma and there's science behind your behaviors, then you realize you're not just broken. Then you're open to, possibility, right? And if you don't understand, your brain is different and it's wired differently and you see threats when they aren't really there and you can break down those barriers, then you can start to pursue your own goals. You know what I mean? But every foster children should go into some sort of therapy entering high school, 15, 16 years old, because that's when they're old enough to understand their brain is wired differently and the world is not against them and they can learn to accept help and they can see the world differently, right? But the other is starting to transition out of foster care. That is just, I think it's probably still a horrific experience. I know today they've extended some of the healthcare benefits and some others, but 17, 18, 19 years old, they still need a lot of support and guidance. And if they want to go on to, further their education, that barrier right now is pretty high.
There's something both beautiful and heartbreaking in what Heather shares here. At 15 or 16 in therapy, someone finally gave her language for what she was feeling. Not that she wasn't broken, but that her brokenness had context, that her brain had been shaped by trauma, and that the way she responded to the world made sense given everything that she'd survived. And that's the thing about mental health in foster care. It's not just about services or diagnosis. It's about telling a young person the truth. What happened to you mattered, and you're not alone for feeling the way you do. Tom Baldwin, who spent years in the thick of this, will tell you it's one of those pivotal moments. Understanding your story doesn't erase the pain, but it can be the first step toward healing.
And the first thing that we wanted to do was talk to them about what could be done to improve outcomes for you. And they gave us a list of things that they would say are the things that need to be improved, some of which are in the study, right? Access to mental health care in a format and a delivery method that works for me, number one. So the flexibility and the coverage of service.
The thing about trauma and survival is that it's like trying to build a house on shifting sand. These young people, they're dealing with this double whammy. First, there's the gaping hole where mental health support should be while they're in the system. And then boom, they hit 18, and even the wobbly stability they did have is gone. It's just gone. And when you're carrying that much weight, that much hurt, well, you find ways to numb the pain, to quiet the voices, even if those ways end up hurting you even more. In Crystabella's case, what turned things around for her wasn't just putting down the drugs, though that was a huge step. No, what really made the difference was having someone in her corner, someone who stuck around when everyone else had walked away, someone who showed up again and again, even as things got messy.
My mom was the only one there for me. I'm going to get emotional. My mom put like $200 a week on my books. She always made sure my phone was good. And I was there for 28 months. That's a lot of money.
And then there's this twist that no one saw coming, not even Crystabella herself. Remember her mom, the one with whom things had been complicated? Well, sometimes life has a way of rewriting its own script. Right when Crystabella was at her lowest, serving time behind bars, it was her mother who became this unwavering presence. Not just with practical stuff, though yeah, she faithfully put money on her daughter's books week after week, but with something far more precious. She showed up. She was there. And in that showing up, in that steady presence when the whole world felt like it was crumbling, something beautiful started to take root. Something that would eventually bloom into Crystabella's path to recovery.
And so I went back to the Hope Center. I completed it. I ended up paroling out. I ended up completing my parole. I went back home. I decided that I wanted to get my peer support license, and I wanted to help people just like me. I did that, and I've worked at StepWorks where I'm at now, and now I'm a shift supervisor, peer support specialist, and now I'm in college. Yeah, I'm actually for psychology, and I've been sober since, and I have a BMW.
Now she's home, not just physically, but emotionally. She's working. She's back in school. She's helping others walk the path that once she had to stumble through. When I listen to her now, confident, focused, deeply human, it's hard not to think about everything that she had to survive just to get to this point. But here's the question I keep coming back to. Why did she have to get to the edge of collapse before anyone helped her build something stable? Why are we waiting until young people fall apart before we begin to catch them? What if we started sooner? What if we started to treat foster youth not as case numbers, but as humans with stories that are still unfolding? And that means rethinking responsibility. Lance Villio saw this firsthand when a group of angry pastors came to the Capitol in Tennessee, demanding answers about why children were sleeping in offices.
Over the last 50 years, the size and scope of government has significantly increased. And in a lot of cases, government is either led to believe or forced to be the chief problem solver. And at the same time, the church has abdicated its responsibility to government.
As they learned more about the constraints facing the Department of Children's Services, something unexpected happened.
I'll never forget, we invited a group of 30 pastors, faith leaders, clergy to the Capitol. It was myself, the governor, and commissioner. I pulled this meeting together, and these faith leaders were furious with the commissioner and with the governor and I. How could we let these kids sleep in offices? And they're very passionate and understandably. And then we went on to explain how did this happen? What was the thing that was broken to get kids sleeping in offices? And, back to the reality that unless community wants government to raise children, which it does not, it is dependent on communities, particularly faith communities, to go inspire people and share the story of the orphans of our day to open their homes. And by the end of it, these pastors asked for forgiveness. And there was a very beautiful moment. Kind of the patriarch of that community went and got on a knee, and he said to the commissioner, "Will you forgive us?" It was this great moment of, oh, this isn't government's problem. This is our problem. These are not government's kids. These are our kids.
What happened in that room was more than a policy conversation. It was a reckoning, a realization that government alone can't fix this, that community, especially faith communities, civic groups, neighbors, have a role to play. And maybe the real shame isn't that these kids are falling through the cracks. It's that there are so many of us standing nearby who haven't looked down. People are starting to realize these aren't just names in some government database. These aren't just the system's kids. They're our kids, our responsibility. And when we talk to someone like Lance about this shift, you can hear the urgency in his voice, the way his whole perspective changed when he stopped thinking about foster care as someone else's problem and started seeing it as a shared calling. So here's what I'm sitting with as we close out this episode. These stories, Gabe, Heather, Crystabella, they're not rare. They're not edge cases or one-offs. They're the quiet truth behind the numbers. And that truth is this, that we've built a system that expects young people to do the impossible, to survive years of instability, disconnection, and trauma. And then at 18, just figure it out. No map, no margin for error, just a handshake, a few documents, and a good luck. But no one makes it alone. That's the myth we keep telling. The reality, what we all really need, what we've always needed, isn't independence. It's interdependence. It's community. It's someone showing up and staying. So if you're listening and you're wondering, what can I do? Start there. Start by seeing these young people not as someone else's responsibility, but as part of your world. Ask how you or your community can show up. Ask what it would look like not just to respond to the crisis, but to build something better before the next one begins. Because if there's one thing these stories make clear, it's this. Foster youth don't need our pity. They need our presence. They need us to believe in their futures, sometimes before they believe in themselves. And when we do that, when we choose to show up, we don't just change their story, we change ours too. Next time on Fracture to Flourish, we're going to look at the people and programs who are reimagining what's possible in foster care. The ones who are saying, maybe we've been doing this all wrong. Maybe the answer isn't asking these kids to be stronger. Maybe it's about building stronger communities around them. I'm Bryce Butler, and you're listening to Fracture to Flourish. Fracture to Flourish is a production of Access Ventures, hosted by Bryce Butler, created and written by Bryce Butler and Jacob Bozarth. Crystal Esquivel is our producer. Bailey Pendleton is our marketing manager. Cover art and design by Justin Esquivel. Editing and production by Jacob Bozarth. Additional editing and production by Pat Kicklighter, Crystal Esquivel, and Bailey Pendleton. I want to extend a special thanks to our partners at the Belmont Innovation Labs and Every Child Tennessee. You can find show notes and resources mentioned on this episode on our website, fracturetoflourish.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review. Your feedback is greatly appreciated. Thank you for listening.